The boy was 9 years old, and he walked through the door of the Iron Revenant clubhouse like he'd already rehearsed dying. Mud on his knees, blood dried brown across his knuckles. His left eye carried the shadow of something that hadn't fully bloomed yet, a bruise still deciding how dark it wanted to go. Outside, the December wind was tearing through Caldwell County like it had a grudge. Inside, 14 men who had survived wars, prisons, and things that don't get names went completely silent. The boy reached into his coat pocket with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking and placed 3 crumpled dollar bills on the bar. "I need to rent a dad," he said, "for 1 hour, please." Nobody breathed. Club President Ronan Creed, 6'2", a jaw like quarried stone, a scar-running jaw to collarbone from a road outside Kandahar, slowly lowered himself to one knee in front of the child. He picked up the $3, folded them, pressed them into the breast pocket of his own leather vest, right over where his heart used to be easier to find. Then he looked up at his brothers. "Looks like we just accepted a job. If you're watching this right now, stay with us, because what these men do next will shake you to your core. Drop a like, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Let's ride." The call had come in just before 9 on a Friday. Not a call, actually, because the boy hadn't used a phone. He'd walked 4 miles through the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache and your thoughts go thin, following the sound of engines to the edge of the industrial district where the Iron Revenant's chapter house sat behind a chain-link fence on a lot that used to be a machine shop. The building still looked like one, corrugated steel walls. A hand-painted sign above the door that someone had done with a stencil and more confidence than talent. 2 Harleys parked out front beneath a security light that buzzed and flickered like it was fighting something internal. Evan Mercer had stood at the fence for 3 full minutes before pushing through the gate. He was 9. He would be 10 in February, a fact he'd been tracking carefully because birthdays in his house had become unreliable in recent years. His mother Claire always tried. She'd fold a 20 into a card and take him to the diner on Route 9, where the booths had red vinyl and the pie was real. But the last 2 birthdays had been interrupted by the sound of a door slamming, and after the door, the other sounds that came next, and after those sounds, the quiet that was somehow worse than all of it. His name was Evan Mercer, but his stepfather called him various other things depending on the hour and the level in the bottle. His mother's name was Claire, and she had a laugh that used to fill rooms, and Evan remembered that about her the way you remember weather from years ago, vivid and distant at the same time, like something that happened to a different version of your life. He'd saved the $3 over 6 weeks. $1.50 from returning bottles he found in the drainage ditch behind the elementary school. 50 cents from his friend Marcus, who owed him for a trade involving a foil-wrapped trading card. $1 from the change his mother left on the kitchen counter on the Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago when Victor wasn't home, when the house breathed differently, when the air didn't have that quality of held tension. The feeling of a room that knows something is coming before anyone in it will admit it. He had counted the money every night before sleep, holding the bills flat against his palm, doing the math in his head the way his teacher, Mrs. Okafor, said to practice arithmetic with real-world problems. $3. That's what a boy with nothing could put together when he needed something enormous. He hadn't known what $3 was worth in terms of help. He'd only known it was everything he had, and that everything he had was what you offered when you were desperate. He'd heard about the Iron Revenant the way kids hear about things they're not supposed to know. Through the spaces between adult conversations, through the lowered voices at the bus stop, through the way Marcus's older brother Deshaun had described seeing them once outside the hardware store on a Saturday, 14 Harleys all idling at a red light, the sound of them moving up through the soles of your feet before it reached your ears. Deshaun had said they looked like something between a funeral and a war party, and he meant it as a compliment. Evan had stored the information without knowing yet what he'd need it for. He knew the night of Victor's gala. He knew from the moment Victor had straightened his tie in the hallway mirror at 6:15, his face smooth and purposeful, wearing the expression he put on for the world outside, the concerned father expression, the pillar of the community expression, that expression that had nothing behind it, that was hollow the way a stage set is hollow, all facade and no rooms. Victor Halden was an attorney. He was, according to the photographs on his office wall and the plaques in the study and the article that ran in the Caldwell County Gazette last spring, a champion of family law, an advocate for domestic violence survivors, A man who had argued before the state court for mandatory protective orders and increased shelter funding. Evan had read the article once, sitting in Victor's study while Victor was at work, and had felt something shift in his stomach that he didn't yet have the language for. The word that would come to him later, years from now, was vertigo. That Friday evening, before Victor left for the Blackridge Country Club Gala, where he was to be honored with the Caldwell Family Values Award, the ceremony and the name of the award were not something Evan had invented. They were printed in silver ink on the invitation that sat on the kitchen counter. Victor had come into the kitchen where Evan's mother was finishing the dishes. Evan had been in the hallway. He hadn't moved. He'd learned early that stillness was a form of safety, that if you made yourself small enough and quiet enough, certain things would happen without noticing you. He heard his mother say something in a voice that was carefully level. He heard Victor's response, which was not level. He heard the sound that followed, then the sound after that, then the sound that was the worst one, which was silence, because silence meant it was over in the way a storm is over. The damage already done, the sky already going still. He heard his mother's voice say his name from the kitchen floor. Quiet. Telling him to go to his room. Telling him she was fine. Using the word fine, the way adults use words that have been hollowed out by repetition until they don't mean anything anymore, until they're just shapes your mouth makes to keep someone from looking too closely. Victor fixed his tie one more time, walked past Evan in the hallway without looking at him, opened the front door, got into his Lexus, left. Evan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his mother, and his mother looked back at him from the floor with the careful expression she wore when she was trying to figure out how much he had seen, how much she needed to manage, how much damage control was required. She had a split lip. She was holding a dish towel against it. Her eyes were doing the thing they did, that complicated calculation that lived in them now, that weighed every response against invisible consequences, that had replaced the other expression, the one from before, the one that went with the laugh that used to fill rooms. "I'm fine," she said. He went and got his coat. He got the $3 from the hollow in the bottom of his sock drawer. He went out the back door and he walked 4 miles through December. The man who opened the Iron Revenant's door when Evan knocked was not small. He was not the kind of man who occupied a doorway so much as he filled it, the way weather fills a landscape, completely, inevitably. He had a beard that was going silver at the edges and eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have seen a great many things and decided to stop being surprised by any of them. He looked at the boy on the step. He looked at the boy's eye. He looked at the boy's knuckles, which were split from where Evan had hit the wooden fence post twice on his way out of the neighborhood, not because the fence post had done anything to deserve it, but because he'd needed to hit something that could take it and not break. "You lost?" the man said. "No, sir," Evan said. The man looked at him for another moment. Then he stepped aside and let him in. The interior of the Iron Revenant clubhouse was several things at once. It was a working space, a long bar along one wall, a pool table with a rip in the felt, a jukebox that was playing something low and southern with a pedal steel guitar threading through it like smoke. It was a kitchen in the back, someone in there right now making something that smelled like chili and onions and the particular warmth of a room that gets used every day. It was a meeting room with a long table at one end around which several men sat with coffee and playing cards and the remnants of a conversation that had been interrupted by the arrival of a 9-year-old at the door. And it was a gallery of sorts, patches on the wall, photographs, a framed flag, objects that meant things to the men who lived here in the way that objects accumulate meaning over years of carrying them. 14 men in that room, various ages, various sizes, various states of assembly, some with cuts on, some in flannels, one in a mechanic's uniform with his name on the chest. They all looked at Evan when he came in, and they all went quiet in the way you go quiet when something unexpected enters your field of vision, and your brain needs a moment to recategorize the world. Ronan Creed was at the bar with a cup of coffee and a document he'd been frowning at. He was the kind of man who had gravity, not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal sense, the sense that the room organized itself around him without anyone having to say so. He was 44 years old, and he had been many things before he was this: a soldier, twice over, and then once more. A man in a hospital bed with tubes in places tubes shouldn't be. A man in a V. a waiting room for 12 hours, who drove home and sat in his truck in his driveway for 45 minutes before he could make himself go inside. A man who had rebuilt himself slowly from the outside in, starting with the bike and the road and the brothers who didn't require explanation. The scar along his jaw was from an IED in the Arghandab River Valley, 2009. Most of the other scars weren't visible. He turned from the bar when the boy entered, and he looked at him with that assessment that combat veterans develop. The rapid, involuntary categorization of a situation, threat level. What the body is telling you that the face is trying to conceal. He saw the eye. He saw the knuckles. He saw the coat that was too thin for the temperature outside. He saw the thing in the boy's posture that he recognized because he had felt it himself. The specific tension of a person who has been managing something enormous for so long that it has started to become the structure of how they hold themselves, load-bearing, the fear and the vigilance built into the architecture of the body. He set down his coffee. He walked to the boy. He crouched, slowly, so their eyes were level. "What's your name?" he said. "Evan?" the boy said. "Evan Mercer." "How old are you, Evan Mercer?" 9. "You walk here?" "Yes, sir." Ronan looked at the thin coat. He looked at the split knuckles. He looked at the eye. "From where?" "Whitmore Street," Evan said. Ronan knew Whitmore Street. It was 4 miles, through December, through the kind of wind that came off the ridge and went through you rather than around you. "What can I do for you?" Ronan said. Evan reached into his coat pocket. His hand was shaking, not from cold, though the cold was part of it. The shaking was something else. The kind that lives in the chest and radiates outward when you've been holding something too big for too long and you've finally arrived somewhere, and you don't know yet if this somewhere is going to be any different from everywhere else you've already tried. He pulled out the $3. He set them on the bar beside Ronan's coffee cup. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked back at Ronan. "I need to rent a dad," he said. "For 1 hour, please." The room was perfectly still. Outside, the wind moved through the chain-link fence and made its wire music. The jukebox was still playing, the pedal steel going on, indifferent. In the kitchen, the chili was still simmering. Everything continued. But in the main room of the Iron Revenant Clubhouse, 14 men who had survived various forms of the worst the world offers had just encountered something they were not equipped to be indifferent to. Ronan looked at the $3. He picked them up. He folded them with 2 careful, deliberate folds. He pressed them into the breast pocket of his leather vest, right over the center of his chest, and he patted the pocket once. Then he looked back at the boy. "Tell me about your mom," he said. Evan Mercer, who had been holding himself together for 4 miles through December, with the specific, rigid composure of a child who has decided that not crying is a form of control he can maintain when everything else is uncontrollable, told him. He told him in the flat, economical way of a child who has recited a situation often enough internally that the emotional charge has temporarily detached from the narrative. He told him about Victor, about the gala, about what had happened in the kitchen at 6:15, about the dish towel, about the word fine. He told it without embellishment, without drama, with the specific awful clarity of a 9-year-old who understands more than any 9-year-old should need to and is not proud of the understanding. When he was done, Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Your mom know where you are?" "No, sir." Ronan nodded. He stood up. He turned to his brothers. The man at the end of the bar was called Pike. He was 40, ex-Navy, had forearms like architectural elements and a quiet that ran deep. He was already putting down his coffee. The man by the pool table was called Ghost. No one used his real name anymore, hadn't for years. And he was already taking his cut from the back of his chair and shrugging into it. The man in the mechanic's uniform was called Teddy, and he was 27 and the youngest full patch in the chapter, and he was already moving toward the door with the focused expression of someone who has found a task they understand. Ronan reached into the cabinet behind the bar. He pulled out a thermos and filled it from the coffee pot. He handed it to Evan. "Drink that," he said. "You're going to wait here for 10 minutes with Biscuit." He indicated a man in the corner who was roughly the size of a refrigerator and had the disposition, apparently, of someone named Biscuit, which is to say kinder than his exterior suggested. "Biscuit's going to get you some of that chili," You're going to tell me if you're allergic to anything. I'm not allergic to anything, Evan said. Good. Ronan pulled on his own cut, smoothed it once across the shoulders, looked at the name on the chest, President, Iron Revenant MC, with the expression of a man accepting a responsibility he has never taken lightly. Then we're going to go have a word with your stepfather. Evan looked up at him. There's 100 people at that gala, he said. His voice was careful. Important people. That's fine, Ronan said. He's getting an award about protecting families. Something moved through the room. It wasn't a sound. It was a quality of stillness, the particular tension that moves through a group of men when they've all reached the same conclusion at the same moment, and the conclusion is not a gentle one. Yeah, Ronan said. I heard you. He looked at his brothers one more time. Then he looked at the boy. Looks like we just accepted a job. There are things that happen in a room that don't require narration. The men of the Iron Revenant had their own language, had built it over years of roads and losses and the specific grammar of men who've chosen each other over the alternatives. It moved through the space in the space of 30 seconds. Cuts were pulled on, boots were laced, keys were pulled from hooks, the jukebox was turned off, the chili was taken off the burner. In less time than it takes to describe it, the clubhouse had been converted from a Friday night to a purpose. Biscuit, whose real name was Gareth, and who had worked with severely at-risk youth for 11 years before a disability forced him to a different kind of work, sat across from Evan at the bar with 2 bowls of chili and a seriousness that did not condescend to the boy. You did the right thing, Biscuit said. Evan looked at the chili. Do you think they can help her? Biscuit considered the question with the full weight it deserved. I've known Ronan Creed for going on 15 years, he said. And in that time, I have never once seen him accept a job he didn't finish. Outside, the sound of Harleys starting moved through the cold air like something primal. 1 engine, then 2, then the rest in succession, each one adding its voice to the accumulation until it was less a collection of sounds and more a single sustained declaration, low and rolling and certain, the way the earth sounds during a geological event. The kind of sound that moves through walls and floor joists and the soles of your feet and into the bones before your brain has had a chance to name it. Evan sat at the bar with his chili and the thermos of coffee, and he listened to the sound fade as they rode out into the night. He sat very still. He did not cry, but his hand, which was holding the thermos, which had finally stopped shaking, slowly relaxed around it, and the grip softened, and the careful, rigid architecture of the 9-year-old who had been managing something enormous for a very long time shifted, just slightly, in a way that was barely perceptible, but was also everything. He didn't know yet what was going to happen at the Black Ridge Country Club. He didn't know about Mara Holloway, or the warrants she'd been carrying for 7 months while she built her case with the specific patient precision of a woman who understood that rushing this particular destruction would mean doing it wrong. He didn't know that 14 men on Harleys riding through the Black Ridge Country Club gates on a Friday night in December was going to become one of those events that people in Caldwell County referred to for years afterward by referencing it only obliquely, in the way you reference weather that left a mark. The night of that thing at the club, the night those bikers came, the night Victor Halden's face changed in front of 300 people. He only knew that the $3 were in Ronan Creed's breast pocket, that someone had taken the money and called it a job, that someone had said yes. He didn't know the last time someone had said yes to him. The Black Ridge Country Club occupied 7 acres on the eastern edge of Caldwell County, where the land went wealthy and manicured, where the trees were the kind of old trees that suggest permanence, that suggest a world that does not fundamentally change, that suggest, to the right kind of person in the right kind of coat, that some things are simply settled. The building itself was Georgian Revival, brick and white columns, lit at night in the particular way of buildings that have never needed to justify their own illumination. The parking lot was full on Friday nights, and fuller than usual on this one. The annual Family Values Gala was one of the significant events on the Caldwell County social calendar, the kind of event that people arranged their Decembers around, that appeared in the society pages, that had a guest list that represented, in its way, a cross-section of the county's institutional infrastructure. Judges, city council, school board, a state senator who had driven down from the Capitol for the occasion. Victor Halden moved through all of it with the ease of a man who has spent 20 years cultivating exactly this landscape, who has learned the specific social geometry of rooms like this. Who to touch on the shoulder, who to address by first name, how to modulate the laugh to signal warmth without vulnerability, how to hold a glass at the level that says comfortable rather than desperate. He was 51, silver at the temples in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old, his suit bespoke and his shoes the kind that require a separate vocabulary to describe. He had practiced the speech. He had practiced the humility, the gratitude, the specific quality of emotion that reads as genuine to people who want to believe it's genuine. He did not think about Whitmore Street. He had a capacity for compartmentalization that his first therapist, 20 years ago, had described as notable, and his second therapist, whom he'd stopped seeing, had described as something else. The evening was arranged, and he moved through it as arranged, and the part of him that contained certain information was somewhere very far away. Behind a door he'd learned to keep closed so thoroughly that sometimes he almost couldn't feel it himself. He was 2 sentences into his thank you speech when the doors opened. The sound came first. That was the thing people described afterward, consistently. The sound that arrived before anything was visible, that moved through the walls of the ballroom the way bass frequencies move, below the level of consciousness before they're above it. A low mechanical thunder, organized, sustained, multiple engines producing a single sustained declaration. The chandeliers, crystal, imported, the pride of the country club's renovation, trembled slightly in their fittings. The wine in the glasses trembled. Then the doors opened. Ronan Creed walked through the doors of the Blackridge Country Club at 9:47 on a Friday night, and he walked through them the way a man walks through a door when he has calculated exactly what is on the other side and decided it does not require any adjustment in his pace. He was wearing his cut. His boots left marks on the polished marble of the foyer. He walked into the ballroom and he stopped, and he looked across 300 feet of parquet floor and chandeliers and white tablecloths and the assembled institutional weight of Caldwell County, and he found Victor Halden at the podium with the same kind of velocity that a rifle finds a fixed point. Behind him came 12 men. They did not make noise. They did not shout or gesture or put on anything for the room. They walked in and they took positions, and the thing they produced, the effect of 12 men in leather moving into a space like this, in silence, was not violence. It was something else, something that occupied the exact same space in the nervous system as the anticipation of violence, that produced the same physiological responses. But that was not violence. It was the suggestion of consequence. The presence of men for whom certain kinds of pretending had already been burned away, and who therefore were immune to the social machinery that relies on pretending. The speech stopped. The room went the specific quiet of 300 people simultaneously deciding to stop making noise. Victor Halden looked at Ronan Creed from across the ballroom, and something happened in his face. Something small and quick, a flicker of the thing behind the door. The part of him that lived on Whitmore Street, before the door came down again, and the composed face reassembled. "There's been some kind of mistake," Victor said into the microphone. "Yeah," Ronan said. His voice carried without effort. It had that quality of voices that are used to projecting across noise and distance and the particular chaos of situations where clear communication matters. "There has." He didn't move from where he stood. He didn't need to. What moved instead was something Ronan had known was coming. The piece of the evening that he had not planned, because you cannot plan for federal investigators, but that he had found out about 40 minutes ago when his phone buzzed with a message from a contact he trusted. And the message had told him that Mara Holloway had been sitting on a warrant for 7 months and had been looking for exactly the right moment to serve it, and that tonight was that moment. Mara Holloway entered from the side door. She was 41 years old, and she had been a federal investigator for 16 of them, and she carried herself with the particular quality of someone who has spent a career in rooms where people are lying to her, and has developed, over years, a comprehensive immunity to the performance of respectability. She was not large. She was not impressive in the conventional sense. But she carried a leather document case, and she moved through the room toward the podium with the focused inevitability of weather, and the 2 federal agents behind her moved with the same quality. And there was something about the combination, the bikers at the door and the federal investigators from the side, that produced in the room the specific sensation of a structure being disassembled from two sides simultaneously. She reached the podium. She looked at Victor Halden. She opened the document case. "Victor Allen Halden," she said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, misappropriation of nonprofit funds, obstruction of justice, and 12 counts of documented domestic assault against Claire Ann Mercer." She paused. She looked at the room, at the judges, at the city council, at the state senator, at the woman from the school board who had co-chaired the charity committee with Victor for 4 consecutive years. "I also have documents here that the United States Attorney's Office has subpoenaed, which includes 7 years of financial records from the Caldwell County Family Safety Initiative, a nonprofit registered in Victor Halden's name, which will demonstrate that approximately $2 million in funds donated for the purpose of domestic violence survivor support were redirected into accounts controlled solely by the defendant." The room did not erupt. That's the thing that people described later. They expected it to erupt, and it did not. It went quieter. The specific quiet of people reconfiguring their understanding of a landscape they thought they knew, a quiet that has volume to it, that is loud with the sound of things being revised. Victor Halden looked at the warrants. He looked at Mara Holloway. He looked at his attorney, who was sitting at table 9 and who was already performing the expression of a man who is working out the math of how quickly he can separate himself from this. Then he looked at Ronan Creed. Ronan walked toward the podium. He walked slowly, in the particular way of a man for whom speed has never been the point. He walked through 300 people who moved aside for him without quite knowing why, the same way water moves around a fixed object, not because of force, but because of something more fundamental than force. He stopped in front of Victor Halden. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the man. He looked at the award plaque on the podium, brass engraved, the Caldwell Family Values Award, and he looked back at Victor's face, and in his own face there was something very controlled and very cold and very, very clear. "There's a boy on Whitmore Street," Ronan said, quietly, for Victor only. "Split knuckles, thin coat, walked 4 miles tonight." Victor said nothing. "He saved up $3. Ronan's voice did not change. It was even and low, the voice of a man who does not need volume to be heard. 6 weeks. He was going to pay someone to help his mother for 1 hour. The silence in the room had a texture to it now. 1 hour, Ronan said. Then he hit him. Once. Controlled, measured, with the specific economy of a man who has been in enough situations to know exactly how much force is required and who does not use an ounce more than necessary. It was not the hit of a brawl. It was the hit of a judgment. Victor Halden went back into the podium, and the award plaque went sideways and hit the floor, and the sound it made, brass on parquet in that absolute silence, was the loudest thing in the room. Mara Holloway looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Mara Holloway. "I'll need him ambulatory," she said. "He's ambulatory," Ronan said. He stepped back. He looked at his brothers, who moved forward and arranged themselves around Victor Halden with the same wordless, choreographed precision they applied to everything. Not as a mob, but as a perimeter. The kind of perimeter that says, this man is accounted for, and he is going to do exactly what comes next. What came next was the ride to Whitmore Street. What came next was the wine cellar. But Evan Mercer, sitting at the bar of the Iron Revenant clubhouse with his bowl of chili and his thermos, didn't know that yet. He didn't know that his mother was not upstairs in their house on Whitmore Street. He didn't know that Victor had been in the habit, when he left for events, of certain precautions that had taken a particular shape over the past year as Claire had grown less manageable, as she'd started to make phone calls, as she'd started to write things down, as she'd started to do the specific things that a woman does when she is quietly building towards something that her abuser can sense before she's consciously admitted it to herself. He didn't know about the wine cellar. He didn't know that Ronan Creed would find out about the wine cellar in about 40 minutes, and that what happened in Ronan Creed's face in that moment would be the thing that Pike, who had known him for 15 years, described later as the only time he'd seen the man's control slip, not into rage, but into something that was very briefly grief. Very briefly, the face of a man who has seen certain things and cannot stop seeing them, before it closed again, and the work continued. He didn't know any of that. He was sitting at the bar. He was eating his chili. His hand had finally stopped shaking. Outside, the December wind moved through the chain-link fence. Inside the clubhouse, Biscuit was telling him about the time Ronan had ridden through a flash flood in Tennessee and how that story ended and how it ended in a way that made you understand, if you were listening, what kind of man this was. And Evan was listening, very carefully, the way a child listens when someone is telling him something that matters, when someone is giving him information he needs, when someone is, without saying so directly, answering the question he's been carrying for years, which is, are there any people in the world who will actually show up? He was listening. And somewhere out in the dark, the engines were still moving through Caldwell County. And somewhere on Whitmore Street, in a house that sat quiet and locked, while its owner stood in front of 300 people having his life disassembled, there was a woman in a wine cellar who did not yet know that her son had walked 4 miles through December with 3 crumpled dollars, did not yet know that 14 men were on their way, did not yet know that someone had said yes. The ride to Whitmore Street took 11 minutes. Ronan knew the route without thinking about it, had learned Caldwell County's geography over 17 years of living in it, had memorized its grid the way soldiers memorize terrain, out of the particular habit of a man who needs to know where everything is before he needs to know where everything is. He knew which lights ran long and which ran short. He knew the patch of black ice that formed on the curve past the old grain elevator every winter. He knew Whitmore Street, the cul-de-sac end of it, the houses that had been nice once, 20 years ago, before the county's economic center of gravity shifted east, and the neighborhood became the kind of neighborhood that still had the bones of something better, but had started to show the wear of being overlooked. He led the formation, and the formation followed without instruction. Pike on his left shoulder, Ghost behind. The rest arranged in the 2-column formation they defaulted to on city streets, not because anyone had told them to, but because they'd ridden together long enough that the collective body knew its own geometry. 12 Harleys moving through the dark. The sound of them traveled ahead and behind, filling the empty streets, bouncing off storefronts, and the fronts of houses where people were already watching from windows, drawn to glass by the low mechanical thunder. The way you're drawn to look at lightning, something in the nervous system that recognizes the frequency and responds before the thinking mind has caught up. They turned onto Whitmore Street at 9:53. The house was a 2-story colonial, white with green shutters, the kind of house that looked like it was trying to maintain an argument it was losing. Porch light on, living room light on behind drawn curtains. Victor's Lexus was gone, obviously. Victor was behind them, currently being processed into the back of a federal vehicle in the parking lot of the Blackridge Country Club, with Mara Holloway managing the paperwork and the state senator trying very hard to look like he'd always suspected something. The house sat quiet in the way of houses that have gotten used to keeping secrets. Manicured front walk. A wreath on the door that someone had put up with the specific effort of performing normalcy. The small maintenance of appearances that people in certain situations do compulsively. The way you keep making the bed in a burning building because the making of the bed is the only thing you still control. Ronan sat on his idling bike in front of the house and looked at it. Pike pulled up beside him. The two of them sat there, engines running, the cold pressing down from above like something with weight. Pike had a way of asking questions without words, had developed it over years of working alongside a man who communicated in the same register. He looked at the house. He looked at Ronan. The question was in the angle of his chin. Ronan killed his engine. The others followed one by one until the street was quiet in that particular after-thunder way that seems quieter than silence because it's measuring itself against what just was. Steam rose from the engine casings. Cold air settled around the group. Nobody moved. Ronan got off his bike and walked to the front door and knocked. Waited. Knocked again. The particular quality of no answer, not the no answer of an empty house, but the no answer of a house where something is wrong with the silence, where the silence has a texture to it that is different from ordinary absence. He'd learned to read that difference. It was a skill he wished he'd never needed to develop. Ronan, Ghost's voice. Low. Ghost was standing at the corner of the house, at the edge of the porch, looking down the side wall. Ghost was 47 and had a face that had been rearranged once by something he didn't discuss, and had healed into new geography. He had, in his years before the club, been a sheriff's deputy in 3 different counties, for reasons that were various, and that he also didn't discuss. What he retained from those years, along with a comprehensive distrust of institutional authority and a knee that ached in cold weather, was an eye for the physical details of a space that most people walk past without registering. He was looking at the side of the house, at the basement-level window, which had been covered from the inside with a piece of heavy cardboard, at the padlock on the exterior basement door, a padlock that was new, that was the kind of padlock that costs money, that was not the kind of hardware you put on a basement door for ordinary purposes. Ronan walked to the side of the house. He stood beside Ghost and looked at the padlock. The thing that happened in his face, in that moment, was the thing Pike would describe later. It was brief. It was the face of a man who has seen certain things and who, in the moment of encountering a new version of those things, cannot entirely prevent the previous versions from surfacing. It was grief, and it was fury, and it was something else that didn't have a name, and it lasted approximately 2 seconds before it closed again. And what replaced it was the cold operational clarity that was, in its way, more frightening than the grief. He held out his hand to Ghost without looking away from the padlock. Ghost reached into his jacket and produced a short steel bar. He placed it in Ronan's hand. The padlock took 4 seconds. The basement stairs were concrete, steep, lit by a single bare bulb on a pull string that Ronan pulled. The smell was cold and must, and the particular underground cold of a space that doesn't get heat, and underneath it, something that his body identified before his mind did. The particular human smell of a confined space, of someone who had been here for some hours without adequate warmth, without adequate water, managing. He went down the stairs and found the wine cellar. It was a room within the basement. Solid core door, another lock, this one interior facing, a sliding bolt on the outside that he shot back. He opened the door. Claire Mercer was sitting on the floor against the far wall with her knees pulled to her chest and a bottle of wine that she had not opened in her hands. Not because she was using it as a weapon, but because having something to hold, apparently, had been the decision her hands had made some hours ago when the decision-making available to her had narrowed to a very small set of options. She was wearing the clothes she'd been wearing when Victor left, a blouse and jeans, no coat, and she was cold in the way of someone who has been cold long enough that they've mostly stopped noticing the physical sensation and have retreated into whatever internal space is available to them in that kind of waiting. She looked at Ronan. He crouched in the doorway, the way he'd crouched in front of her son. Same posture, same level. "My name is Ronan Creed," he said. "Your son sent us." Something moved through Claire Mercer's face that was large and complicated and passed quickly, the way weather passes over open ground, relief and terror, and the particular devastation of learning that the thing you'd stopped allowing yourself to hope for has in fact happened. "Evan," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "Is he—" "He's safe," Ronan said. "He's at our place. He's warm. He ate." She put her hand over her mouth, the bottle of wine pressed against her knee. She was not crying, was in the place past the immediate availability of crying, where you've been managing something for long enough that the body has had to redirect resources. "Victor is in federal custody," Ronan said. "Has been for about 20 minutes. She looked at him. She looked at the man behind him, Pike, who had come down the stairs and was standing at the bottom with his hands quiet at his sides, and an expression that was careful and still and non-threatening in the specific way of a large man who has learned to make himself as non-threatening as possible in rooms where someone has reason to be afraid of large men. "Who are you?" Claire said. "Iron Revenant," Ronan said. "Motorcycle club. We have a chapter house on the edge of the industrial district. Your son walked 4 miles to find us." She looked at him for a long moment. She was doing something complex in that look, assessing, recalibrating, running something through the particular exhausted skepticism of a woman who has learned that help that appears unexpectedly tends to come with its own complications. "He walked 4 miles, she said. "In December," Ronan said. "Thin coat." Another thing moved through her face. She set the wine bottle down very carefully on the concrete floor. She put her hands on her knees. She looked at the door that had been locked from the outside. "How long have you been down here?" Ronan said. She thought about it. The thinking about it was its own kind of answer, so the way you have to think about a duration that was characterized by its sameness, that blurred. Since 6:30, she said. Ronan was quiet for a moment. He did the math. It was now past 10. He sat with the math. Can you walk? He said. Yes, she said. I can walk. She could walk. She walked up the basement stairs with a hand on the concrete wall for the first few steps. Not because her legs weren't working, but because her body was recalibrating the specific geometry of not confined. And then she was on the side yard of the house on Whitmore Street, and there were 12 men in leather standing in the cold night air around her, and none of them spoke, and none of them moved toward her. And the collective stillness of them was, in its way, the most carefully considered thing they could have offered her. Ghost had gone back to his bike and retrieved a blanket from the saddlebag. The specific kind of emergency preparedness that characterized men who had spent years in conditions where the difference between prepared and unprepared was sometimes categorical. He held it out to Claire without speaking. She took it. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She looked at the house. Then she looked at the 12 men. Then she looked at Ronan. My son paid you, she said. He tried, Ronan said. How much did he have? $3. She made a sound. It was brief and involuntary, and not quite a laugh, and not quite crying, something that occupied the space between them that language doesn't fully cover. She pulled the blanket tighter. He's been saving for weeks, she said. I didn't know what he was saving for. Now you do, Ronan said. He pulled out his phone and called Biscuit. The call lasted 40 seconds. He handed the phone to Claire. On the other end, Evan's voice, 8 words, that was all. Just, Mom, I'm okay. Are you okay? And Claire Mercer, standing on the winter yard of the house on Whitmore Street with a blanket around her shoulders and 12 men at a respectful distance, said yes. Yes, I'm okay. And her voice, in that moment, carried in it the specific weight of a word that is being used honestly for the first time in a very long time. The next 3 hours were procedural and necessary, and mostly graceless in the way that the aftermath of terrible things is graceless. The arrival of Mara Holloway's federal team, the documentation of the wine cellar, the photography, and the measurements and the forms in triplicate, the careful neutral voice of the federal investigator who had been building this case for 7 months and who moved through the house with a thoroughness that was close to tenderness. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Office arrived, represented by Deputy Sheriff Mark Coulter, who had the expression of a man who is calculating very quickly how his institutional relationship with Victor Halden is going to read in the documentation and finding the calculation alarming. Mara Holloway looked at Mark Coulter in a specific way that communicated precisely how much she already knew about his institutional relationship with Victor Halden, and Mark Coulter looked back at her and then looked very carefully at something else. Ronan stood on the front porch through most of it with a cup of coffee that someone had produced from somewhere. Teddy had found the kitchen and made a pot, because Teddy defaulted to utility in situations where utility was the most useful contribution available. Ronan drank the coffee and watched the street and said very little. At 11:15, Pike came out and stood beside him. They stood without speaking for a while. That was a thing about the years. The ability to be adjacent to another person in silence without the silence requiring management. Holloway wants a statement, Pike said. She'll get one. She also wants to know how we knew about tonight. We didn't, Ronan said. A boy walked through our door. Pike was quiet for a moment. That's going to be the story. You know that. It is the story. People are going to want it to be a different story. Coordinated, planned. People can want whatever they want. Pike looked at him sideways. He had known Ronan Creed since a tent in the Korengal Valley in 2007 where they had been 2 of 4 people who walked out, and he had spent 17 years watching this man make decisions, and had never once seen him make one for effect, for appearance, for the way it would read to people who needed a different story. It was one of the things that made him difficult to work with and essential to trust. The senator's office called the chapter house, Pike said. Ronan turned to look at him. Biscuit took the call. Senator wants to talk. About framing. Framing, Ronan said. He used the word narrative. He can keep his narrative, Ronan said, and turned back to the street. But there was something else in that. something that Pike caught and filed away. The senator knew to call the chapter house, which meant the senator knew enough about the Iron Revenant's involvement to know that the conversation needed to happen, which meant the senator was already managing, already in the mode of management that people in certain positions enter when a situation has escaped its original container and is now moving through the public air unsupervised. Which meant the fallout from tonight was going to be larger and less predictable than a straightforward federal arrest, was going to move into political territory, institutional territory, the territory where people with resources and connections do what people with resources and connections do when they feel cornered. And that meant the Iron Revenant, who had walked into the Blackridge Country Club on a Friday night and ridden to Whitmore Street and broken a padlock and found a woman in a wine cellar and had done all of it because a 9-year-old boy walked through their door with $3, was now in a situation that was not going to end with Victor Halden's arrest. Pike knew this. He suspected Ronan knew it too. He didn't say it out loud because some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. At midnight, Mara Holloway came out onto the porch. She was a precise woman. Not cold, but precise. In the way of someone who has learned that precision is its own form of care, that doing the work correctly is a way of honoring the people the work is about. She had a notepad and a pen, and she looked at Ronan with the expression of a woman who has assessed a great many situations and has landed on this one with a specific, considered conclusion. "You hit him," she said. "Once," Ronan said, "in front of 300 witnesses." "That's correct." "I'm going to need to make a decision about that." Ronan looked at her. "Make it." She studied him. "You knew I was coming." "I found out 40 minutes before." "From who?" "From someone who knew you'd been building the case and knew tonight was the window." He paused. "I didn't plan tonight, Agent Holloway. A boy walked into my club at 9 o'clock with $3 and a split lip and told me his stepfather was getting a Family Values Award. I'm a veteran. I know how to improvise." Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "The senator called your chapter house," she said. "I heard. He's going to try to position tonight as a vigilante incident. He's going to suggest that the federal case was compromised somehow, tainted by your presence. He's going to use the word optics." "Can he?" Mara Holloway looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "The federal case was 7 months of sealed documentation before tonight. Your presence in that ballroom didn't generate the evidence. It just changed the venue where it got served." She paused. "But he's going to try. And he has resources and a communication team and a set of relationships with local media that I don't have, and that matters." Ronan drank his coffee. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need your statement to be completely honest, completely complete, and completely voluntary," Mara said. "I need there to be no daylight between what you say happened and what the evidence shows happened. Because the senator is going to look for daylight. And if he finds any gap, any inconsistency, any place where your account and the physical record don't lock together perfectly, he's going to drive a very expensive truck through it." "My account is what happened," Ronan said. "Then we don't have a problem," she said. She went back inside. Ronan stood on the porch. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It had gone cold, but the weight of it was still useful. Something to hold. He understood now why Claire had held the wine bottle. He was not naive about what Mara Holloway hadn't said. She told him the case was solid. She told him the senator couldn't taint the evidence. What she hadn't told him was that it didn't matter. That a man with resources and connections and a political apparatus doesn't need to taint evidence to create damage. You can lose a clean fight. You can win in court and lose everywhere else. He'd been in enough situations to understand that the outcome you need and the outcome you get are not always the same thing, and that the distance between them is sometimes occupied by money and relationships and the specific machinery that wealthy people have access to when they feel genuinely threatened. Victor Halden was in federal custody, but Victor Halden's friends were not. And Victor Halden's friends had, in the last 3 hours, developed a very clear motivation to make the Iron Revenant the story. It started at 2 in the morning with a post on the Caldwell County Community Forum. An anonymous post, poorly worded in a way that suggested it had been deliberately poorly worded, that described the events at the Black Ridge Country Club as a violent incursion by a known motorcycle gang that had disrupted a legal private event and assaulted a member of the community. The post was shared 40 times before Teddy, who monitored these things with a vigilance born of previous experience with exactly this kind of information operation, texted the chapter a screenshot. By 2:30, a local news station had picked it up with the framing of a question. Was tonight's gala incident a setup? By 3 a.m., and the question had been answered in various ways in various places, none of them with particular attention to what had actually happened, all of them with particular attention to the images that circulated from someone's phone at the gala. Images that showed the Iron Revenant walking into a ballroom, that showed Ronan standing in front of Victor at the podium, that did not show the warrants, that did not show Mara Holloway's badge, that did not show the basement padlock, or the wine cellar, or a 9-year-old boy who had walked 4 miles through December with 3 crumpled dollars. Context is heavy. Images travel light. Ronan understood this, had understood it since a different version of it, in a different country, when photographs of a situation he'd been part of had moved through media in a way that bore a technical relationship to the events they depicted, while communicating something functionally different from what had occurred. The photograph is real. The image is constructed. The meaning is chosen by whoever controls the frame. He was sitting in the chapter house at 3 a.m. with the Corps officers. Himself, Pike, Ghost, Teddy, and a woman named Lena Parrish, who served as the chapter's legal counsel and who had arrived at 1 a.m. in a coat over her pajamas with a legal pad and the calm, slightly terrifying focus that characterized her approach to everything that required it. When the second thing happened. The second thing was a phone call to Ghost's personal cell at 3:15 a.m. from a number that Ghost looked at for a moment before he took the call outside, and when he came back in, his face had the closed quality it got when something internal had been locked down. "Who was that?" Ronan said. Ghost set the phone face down on the table. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table surface, a thing he did when he was organizing something that needed organizing before he could put it in words. "Sergeant Devin Crow," he said, "Caldwell County Sheriff's Criminal Division." The room was quiet. "He called to tell me," Ghost said, "that the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office is opening an investigation into the Iron Revenant MC for racketeering, conspiracy, and what he described as organized criminal activity in connection with tonight's incident at the Black Ridge Country Club." Lena's pen stopped moving. Pike looked at the table. Teddy, who was 27 and still had moments of genuine surprise, said, "Are you—" and then stopped because he'd completed the thought himself. "Crow," Ronan said. "Crow is the deputy sheriff who was on scene tonight." "He was there for about 40 minutes, Ghost said. "He watched Mara Holloway document the wine cellar. He filed his initial report, and then he went somewhere and made phone calls for the rest of the night." "To who?" Lena said. Ghost looked at her. The look communicated that the answer to that question was the question they were all now sitting with, and that the answer was not yet available, and that the unavailability of the answer was itself information. Lena was already writing on her legal pad. She had a stillness when she was working that was different from the stillness of the men around her. Theirs was physical, learned in environments where physical stillness was useful. Hers was intellectual, learned in courtrooms. The stillness of a mind that has organized itself around a complex problem and is moving through it systematically. She was 45, had clerked for a federal judge, had spent 8 years as a public defender before going into private practice, and had been the Iron Revenant's legal counsel for 6 years following a situation that she also didn't discuss in detail, but that had resulted in the chapter developing a comprehensive appreciation for having a very good lawyer on call. "Racketeering is a specific charge," she said without looking up. "It requires demonstrating that the organization functions as an ongoing criminal enterprise. They don't have that because you're not one. But if they're making this call tonight, 3 hours after the fact, then they're not planning to build a case. They're planning to make noise." "Noise does what they need," Pike said. "Noise does exactly what they need," Lena agreed. "You're already in the media, at a criminal investigation into the frame, and the story becomes about you rather than Victor Halden. Federal case gets pushed to background, becomes complicated. The people who want to frame tonight as a vigilante incident suddenly have official institutional support for that framing." "Who's driving this?" Ronan said. Nobody answered immediately. Not because they didn't have candidates. They had candidates, the same candidates, and the candidates were the same as the ones they'd been sitting with since the senator's call came in at midnight. But because naming it meant arriving at the place where a decision had to be made about how to respond to it, and decisions made at 3 in the morning after a night like tonight had to be made carefully. Ronan pushed back from the table. He stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the lot where the bikes sat in their rows, covered in a thin skin of December frost, and he stood there looking at them. If we fight this the way they want us to fight it, he said, we lose. That's what they're counting on. We respond, we escalate, we give them images and incidents that they can use. So we don't respond, Teddy said. We respond, Ronan said. We just don't do it the way they expect. Mara Holloway, Pike said. Ronan turned from the window. Mara Holloway built a 7-month case. She has the documentation, she has the financial records. She has 12 counts of documented assault. He paused. She also has something they haven't thought about. The boy, Ghost said. The word landed in the room and sat there. Evan Mercer. 9 years old, split knuckles and a thin coat and 3 crumpled dollars, who had walked 4 miles through December because there was nowhere else to go, and who had sat at the Iron Revenant's bar and eaten chili and held a thermos with a hand that eventually stopped shaking, who was, right now, asleep in the room at the back of the chapter house that they kept for exactly these situations. The situations that weren't supposed to exist but did. They can make us the story, Ronan said, but they cannot make him not real. Lena looked up from her legal pad. She looked at Ronan for a long moment with the expression of a lawyer who is running something through her professional assessment and arriving at a conclusion she finds both complicated and unambiguous. That's true, she said. But if you use him, if this becomes a story that's carried by a child— I'm not using him, Ronan said. I'm saying he exists, and the things that happened to his mother exist, and the evidence in that wine cellar exists. And none of that changes because the senator has a communications team and Devin Crow made phone calls at midnight. He looked around the room. They're going to come at us, he said. All of it, the investigation, the media, the political machinery, all of it directed at making what we did tonight into something that fits their story. He paused. We have one advantage. We actually know what happened. The room held that. Then Ghost said, And the boy? Ronan was quiet for a moment. The boy stays out of it until he doesn't have to be, he said. His mother makes every decision about that. Nothing moves without her word. Ghost nodded. That was an answer he could live with. Lena was already writing again. Pike was looking at his phone. Messages coming in. The chapter network processing the night's events in real time across the regional brotherhood. Ghost was looking at the table with that internal expression that meant he was holding something he hadn't released yet, some piece of the night that was still working through him. It was Teddy who asked the thing the room hadn't asked yet. Ronan, he said. His voice was careful, the voice of a 27-year-old choosing his angle. The senator, Crow, Victor's people. He paused. How high does this actually go? Ronan looked at him. I don't know yet, he said. But you think it goes higher than tonight? Ronan picked up his cold coffee and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down. I think a man like Victor Halden doesn't steal $2 million from a survivor fund and beat his wife and daughter into a wine cellar for years without someone helping him not be noticed, he said. I think the people who helped him not be noticed are now in a situation where they can either let him fall and hope the fire doesn't spread to them, or they can try to control the fire by controlling what tonight gets to mean. He looked at Teddy. They're going to try to control it, he said, which means tonight isn't over. Outside the chapter house, in the row of bikes under the frost and the sodium lights, in the cold that had settled now past the point where it was uncomfortable and into the point where it was simply the ambient condition of existing in December, there was no movement. There was no sound. The street was empty. But at 4 in the morning, as Ronan was finally alone in his office going through documents with Lena, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it for a long moment before he opened it. The message was 4 words. They know about Kandahar. He sat very still. He read it again. He set the phone face down on the desk, and he sat for 30 seconds with his hands flat on the desk, and his breathing very controlled, and the particular quality of stillness in his face that was the stillness of a man who has just encountered something that was supposed to be behind a door that he had shut very carefully years ago and has now found the door open. Lena looked up from her legal pad. She looked at his face. "What?" she said. He turned the phone over. He pushed it across the desk to her. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. "What happened in Kandahar?" she said. And Ronan Creed, who had crouched in front of a 9-year-old boy and folded $3 into his breast pocket and said, "Looks like we just accepted a job," who had ridden through December to a ballroom and a padlocked wine cellar and had done all of it with the flat operational clarity of a man for whom certain kinds of purpose are the same as oxygen, looked at his lawyer across the desk and for the first time in a very long time had no answer that he was willing to give. Lena Parrish had been a lawyer for 19 years, and she had learned in those years that the most dangerous thing a person can say is not a lie. Lies have structure. Lies have internal logic. Lies can be mapped and followed and eventually cornered. The most dangerous thing a person can say is something true that they don't explain. 4 words with no antecedent, no context, no return address, delivered at 4 in the morning to a man who has just spent the night being precisely the kind of person that powerful people need to discredit. She read the message again. They know about Kandahar. She set the phone down on the desk between them. She folded her hands on top of her legal pad. She looked at Ronan Creed and she waited, because Lena Parrish had also learned that the second most dangerous thing you can do in a room with a person holding something heavy is rush them. Ronan was looking at the wall behind her, not at anything on the wall. At the wall itself, the way you look at a surface when you're actually looking at something interior, when the external field of vision has been temporarily repurposed as a screen for something private. His hands were flat on the desk. His breathing was controlled in the specific way of a man who is controlling it on purpose, who has practiced the controlling of it in situations where the alternative was worse. Outside, the December cold pressed against the chapter house walls. A gust moved through the chain-link fence and produced its wire music. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked once, the heating system making its nightly argument with the temperature. "Kandahar," Lena said. Not a question, a prompt. Ronan picked up the phone. He turned it over in his hand. He set it face down again. 2009, he said. Second deployment. We were running a route clearance mission in the Arghandab River Valley, about 12 kilometers outside Kandahar city. He paused. 4 vehicles. My team plus attached assets. 2 additional units we'd been working with for 3 weeks. Lena wrote the date on her legal pad. She didn't look up. We hit an IED at the 4th kilometer. Primary vehicle. I was in the 2nd. He touched his jaw briefly with 2 fingers. The scar, the reflex, the thing the body remembers in its own vocabulary. We lost 2 men in the primary vehicle immediately. I took shrapnel. 3 others were wounded. He stopped. Lena waited. One of the attached assets was a man named Colonel Richard Payne, Ronan said. He wasn't supposed to be on that route that day. He was supposed to be at a command meeting in Kandahar City. He was on that vehicle because... He stopped again. The stopping was different this time. Not the hesitation of a man finding language, but the hesitation of a man deciding how much of a locked room to open and how far. Because I'd been told 2 days before that Payne was running a procurement diversion through local contractors. Equipment budget being redirected. Not small amounts. Who told you? Lena said. A source I trusted. An Afghan national who'd worked with coalition forces for 4 years, who had access to contractor records. Ronan's voice was even. It had the flatness of a testimony, of something that has been rehearsed internally many times without ever being spoken aloud. I reported it up, through proper channels, to my commanding officer. And my commanding officer told me to drop it, told me the source was unreliable, told me Payne's record was clean and that my job was route clearance, not CID work. He paused. I dropped it. But Payne ended up on the vehicle, Lena said. He was on the vehicle because 2 hours before the mission, he requested to join it. Said he wanted field time. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Ronan looked at his hands. He survived the IED. I didn't know at the time whether that was coincidence. I was being airlifted to Kandahar airfield. I had shrapnel in 3 places and a concussion that put me under for 18 hours. Lena was writing steadily now, her pen moving across the legal pad in the tight, economical hand of someone who takes notes for a living. What happened to the investigation into the procurement diversion? It died, Ronan said. I filed a supplemental report from the hospital. I followed up twice after I was stateside recovering. I was told both times that the matter had been reviewed and found unsubstantiated. He paused. Payne was promoted 8 months later, retired as a brigadier general 2 years after that. The room was quiet. And now someone knows about this, Lena said, and is using it as leverage. Someone is warning me that someone knows about it, Ronan said, which could mean 2 things. Either whoever sent this message is on our side and trying to give us time to prepare, or the warning is the threat, Lena said, a demonstration that they have reach, that they have access to things you thought were buried. Yes. Lena set down her pen. She looked at him directly. Ronan, is there anything in what happened in Kandahar that, if surfaced, could be used against you? Not used to embarrass you. Used against you. Legally. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. There was a second report, he said, filed 6 months after I got stateside. Not through official channels. Through a journalist, investigative reporter for a defense publication. I gave her everything I had, everything my source had given me, everything I'd documented before the mission. What happened to the report? She published it, Ronan said. It ran for 1 news cycle. Then Payne's people moved, and the publication retracted it, citing insufficient sourcing, and the reporter, her name was Dana Marsh, lost her position. He paused. 3 months after that, she died in a car accident outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The silence in the room had changed quality. Lena looked at him for a long moment. Did you ever believe it was an accident? Ronan looked back at her with the flat, exhausted expression of a man who has lived with a question for 14 years without being able to answer it in any direction that helped. No, he said. I never believed it was an accident. Lena picked up her pen. She was very still for a moment, the stillness of a lawyer who has just had the dimensions of a situation revised significantly upward and is reorganizing around the new dimensions. She was not panicking. Lena Parrish did not panic in the way that other people panicked. She had something that functioned like panic but ran inward rather than outward, that compressed rather than expanded, that produced not chaos but a very cold, very precise focus. Who is Richard Payne now? She said. Retired, Ronan said. Private sector. Defense contracting. Where? Ronan looked at her. He's on the board of the Caldwell Family Safety Initiative, he said. Victor Halden's nonprofit. The sound that Lena made was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound that should have happened, the breath she didn't take, the response that didn't come, the moment between recognition and language. She looked at her legal pad. She looked at the name she had written. She looked at Ronan. How long have you known that? She said. About 40 seconds, he said. And that was the truth. He had known Payne's name in connection with defense contracting, had known it was somewhere in the landscape of his awareness, but the specific connection to the nonprofit, to Victor Halden, to Caldwell County, that connection had just assembled itself in the space between saying Payne's name and hearing himself say it in this room, in this context, in the room where he was sitting 4 hours after breaking a padlock on a wine cellar in which Victor Halden had locked a woman who had been building a case against him. Building a case. Claire Mercer, who had been making phone calls and writing things down. The specific behaviors that an abuser reads as threat. What had she been building a case about? Domestic abuse? Yes. That was what the night had presented as. But Claire Mercer was a paralegal. He'd learned that from Mara Holloway's briefing in the front yard of the Whitmore Street house. She had worked at a law firm in Caldwell County for 9 years before Victor, and had continued working there in the 3 years of their marriage, and had stopped working there 8 months ago under circumstances that Mara had described as abrupt, and that the firm had described to federal investigators as a voluntary resignation. 8 months ago, which was 7 months before Mara Holloway had begun building her case. 1 month before. "Lena," Ronan said, "what does a paralegal at a Caldwell County law firm have access to?" Lena looked at him. She was ahead of him. He could see it in her face, see the place where she'd already arrived and was waiting for him. "Depends on the firm," she said carefully. "A firm that does nonprofit compliance work," Ronan said. "Financial filings, tax documentation." Lena set her pen down very precisely. "She found something," Ronan said, "at the firm, before she left, before Victor locked her out of everything she could access from inside their life." He paused. "That's why she was in the wine cellar tonight. Not just because she was building toward leaving him, because she had something specific, something that went past the domestic situation." "If that's true," Lena said, "then the federal case Mara Holloway has been building might be smaller than what Claire Mercer knows," Ronan said. They looked at each other across the desk. "We need to talk to her," Lena said. "Not tonight," Ronan said. "She's with her son. She's been in a wine cellar for 4 hours. It waits until morning." Lena nodded. She looked at the phone on the desk. "And the message?" "Stays between us," Ronan said, "until I know who sent it." He picked up the phone. He looked at the number one more time. He knew, with the particular certainty of long experience with information that arrives without a return address, that tracing the number would produce a dead end, a burner, a forwarding service, something that would dissolve under examination. Whoever sent it had wanted him to know the content and had not wanted to be identified. That narrowed the field but didn't close it. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood up. "Get some sleep," he said to Lena. "Ronan." 2 hours, he said. "There's a couch in the back. Take it. We start again at 6. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to push a point she knows she won't win. She made the experienced decision. 2 hours, she said. He turned off the office light. He walked through the main room, which was empty now. The brothers had dispersed to various states of rest in the hours since midnight, some in the chapter house, some at their own places. The fire in the stove had burned to coals. The jukebox was dark. The pool table sat in the half-dark with its ripped felt and its particular gravity, the way objects in empty rooms have gravity at 4 in the morning. He stopped at the door of the back room. He opened it quietly. Evan was asleep on the cot in the corner, Biscuit's old army blanket pulled up to his chin. His face, in sleep, had released the careful composure it wore when he was managing something enormous. The architecture of vigilance had come down, and what was underneath was just a 9-year-old face, a child's face, doing what children's faces do in the absence of the thing they're afraid of. His knuckles rested on top of the blanket. The splits had been cleaned and bandaged by Biscuit, who had a first aid kit and a thoroughness that came from years of working with kids who got hurt in various ways. The bandages were white in the dark, small. His hands were small. Ronan stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not go in. He did not need to go in. He just looked at the hands and the face and the blanket, and he held what he was holding. The message, the name, Kandahar. Dana Marsh's car outside Raleigh, the wine cellar padlock, the non-profit board, the thing Claire Mercer had found at the law firm. He held all of it and looked at the 9-year-old who had set all of it in motion by walking 4 miles through December with $3 and a request that a man who had stopped being surprised by the world somehow found he could not refuse. He closed the door. He went to the front window and looked out at the lot and the bikes and the frost and the sodium lights and the empty street. He stood there until the first gray suggestion of morning began at the edge of the sky, and then he made 3 phone calls that he would not describe to Lena or to Pike or to anyone else until he knew whether the information they returned was going to save them or confirm something he was not yet ready to have confirmed. The morning arrived gray and wet, the kind of December morning that isn't quite cold enough for snow and isn't quite warm enough to be dignified about it, just a persistent cold rain that came in sideways and turned every surface dark. By 6:30, the chapter house was awake and operating, coffee on and the particular noise of a group of men who have collectively slept badly, resuming their positions around a problem. Claire Mercer was in the kitchen with Evan and Biscuit. She was drinking coffee, and she had the appearance of a woman who had slept briefly and incompletely and had woken to the situation she'd fallen asleep in, which is always a particular kind of disorientation. She'd been given dry clothes, but a flannel shirt of Teddy's that was 3 sizes too large, jeans that were closer to her size from a lost and found box that the chapter kept. She had washed her face. Her lip was swollen in the specific way of a split that has had time to settle, a bruise working through the spectrum beneath her eye. Evan was sitting beside her with his shoulder touching her arm. The contact minimal, maintained, the specific way of a child who needs to confirm presence through continuous low-level physical connection, but who has also learned to do it in a way that doesn't draw attention to the need. Ronan sat across from them. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking. "I need to ask you something," he said to Claire, "and I need you to tell me if you don't want to answer, or if you need more time, or if you want to wait until we're—" He glanced at Evan. "He can hear it," Claire said. "He's heard everything else." Evan looked at Ronan with the expression of a child who has been included in a sentence about his own comprehension and is waiting to see if the adult will follow through or retreat into the usual management. Ronan followed through. "When you were at the law firm," he said, "before you left, you found something." Claire's coffee cup stopped moving. "You weren't just building a case about the abuse," Ronan said. "You found something in the firm's documentation, something connected to Victor and the nonprofit." The kitchen was very quiet, rain on the window, the coffee maker finishing its cycle. Claire looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the same calculation she'd done in the wine cellar. The exhausted, sophisticated assessment of a woman who has learned to measure the distance between a person who is offering help and a person who wants something. The measuring was visible in her face, and it was not shameful. It was the product of years of developing a necessary skill, and it had kept her alive in a situation that required it. "Yes," she said. "What did you find?" She set her coffee cup down. She looked at her hands on the table. She had the hands of a woman who worked. There was nothing decorative about them. They were capable hands, a working person's hands. She looked at them for a moment the way you look at something you're deciding to hand over. "The Caldwell Family Safety Initiative files were handled by the firm," she said. "Annual compliance filings, tax documents, board minutes. I'd been processing them for 3 years. They were routine." She paused. 8 months ago, the firm took on a new client, a defense contractor called Paladin Group LLC. And in the course of setting up the new client files, I was cross-referencing board memberships, standard conflict of interest check, and I found that one of Paladin's board members was also on the CFSY board. She looked up. A man named Richard Payne. The name hit the kitchen like a stone hits water. Ronan was very still. Across the table, Lena, who had come in quietly 3 minutes ago and taken a position at the counter that was technically adjacent and practically listening, stopped moving. "And that was unusual," Ronan said carefully. "It wasn't unusual by itself," Claire said. "Overlapping board memberships happen. But when I ran the financial cross-reference, also standard, I found transactions between the CFSI accounts and a subsidiary of Paladin Group. Not large individual amounts, small amounts, frequent, routed through a consulting fee structure." She paused. "Over 4 years, the total was approximately $900,000. Lena exhaled. It was a controlled exhale, the kind that manages a response rather than releasing one. "On top of the $2 million Victor redirected himself," Ronan said. "I didn't know about that then," Claire said. "I knew about the Paladin transactions, and I knew—" She stopped. She looked at her coffee. She looked at Evan, who was watching her with the steady, unfrightened attention of a child who has decided that the truth, however large, is preferable to the management of its size. "I knew that Victor knew I'd found it. He had access to my work computer. He had access to a lot of things I thought I kept separate." She paused. "He told me, very calmly, the night I found it, that the information was not mine, that I had seen something that required a specific kind of understanding that I did not have, that the correct response was to complete the filing and move on." "And when you didn't move on," Ronan said, "I stopped working at the firm 8 months ago," she said. Her voice was flat. The flatness was its own description of what stopping working at the firm had involved. "And things at home became She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Evan put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't look at her when he did it. He just put his hand there. She turned hers over and held it. Ronan looked at Lena. Lena was already on her phone, her back to the room, her voice low and precise. She was calling someone who answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 90 seconds and consisted primarily of Lena's voice asking 3 questions and listening to answers that Ronan couldn't hear. She hung up. She turned around. Richard Payne retired from the Paladin Group Board 14 months ago, she said. 3 months after Claire left the firm. She paused. His exit from the board was described in the corporate filing as voluntary and effective immediately. No transition period. No standard severance acknowledgement. He knew the files had been seen, Pike said from the doorway. He'd come in at some point, silently, the way Ghost moved, the way men with certain training moved through spaces without announcing it. He was holding a coffee and leaning against the doorframe with the expression of a man who has been listening long enough to have arrived at a conclusion. He didn't disappear, though, Ronan said. He stepped back, quietly, from that specific position. But not from Halden, Lena said. His relationship with Halden's network, the social network, the political network. We don't know what that looks like. We know the board membership. We don't know the depth of the connection underneath it. Mara Holloway, Ronan said. I'm going to call her in 10 minutes, Lena said. But, Ronan, she paused. If Payne is embedded in this, and Payne has the connections your source described 15 years ago, military procurement, political protection, the kind of reach that can retire a news story in one cycle, then what we're looking at here is not just Victor Halden and his nonprofit. We're looking at a structure, something that used the CFSY as one component of something larger. The rain came harder against the window. The sound of it filled the kitchen for a moment. And last night, Ghost said from somewhere behind Pike, he had materialized in the hallway, his face bearing the specific marks of a man who has not slept. Last night, we walked into the middle of it and announced ourselves. Nobody answered that. It didn't require an answer. It was the shape of the situation, stated plainly, and the plainness of it was its own weight in the room. Evan was looking at Ronan. Are you in trouble? He said. Ronan looked at him. We're working on it, he said. Because of me, Evan said. Not a question, a statement. The statement of a 9-year-old who has been doing cause and effect calculations for long enough to be very quick at them, who has learned to trace the consequences of his own existence backward to the moments that generated them. Because of the right thing, Ronan said. Evan considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Those aren't always the same thing, he said. The room went quiet in a different way. Ronan looked at this child, at the 9-year-old who had said those aren't always the same thing, with the flat, unrhetorical precision of someone who has already learned, at 9, that the world does not automatically reward what is correct. And something moved through his chest that was large and unnameable, and that he did not show in his face. No, he said, they're not always the same thing. But you did it anyway, Evan said. Yeah, Ronan said. Then you'll figure out the rest, Evan said. He picked up his fork and went back to the eggs Biscuit had put in front of him, with the decisive practicality of a child who has reached a conclusion and filed it and moved on. At 8:15, the first vehicle appeared on the street outside the chapter house. Teddy saw it from the window, an unmarked dark sedan parked at the end of the block, engine running. He watched it for 3 minutes before he said anything. He watched it the way you watch something when you're trying to determine whether it's what you think it is, when you're hoping your pattern recognition is malfiring. It wasn't malfiring. Ronan, he said. The second vehicle appeared 12 minutes later. Same model, different position, north end of the block, both with sight lines to the chapter house entrance. Sheriff's office, Ghost said. He was standing beside Teddy at the window, his coffee gone cold in his hand. Unmarked, but Caldwell County plates. Same fleet as Crow's vehicle last night. They're not here to arrest anyone, Pike said. They'd send marked units for that. They're watching. Making sure we know they're watching, Ronan said. He was behind them, in the middle of the room, his voice carrying the specific quality of a man who is holding a large number of variables simultaneously and is arranging them by priority. which means someone wants us to know the perimeter exists before they decide what to do with it. Crow, Ghost said. Someone above Crow, Ronan said. Crow doesn't have the clearance to authorize surveillance on a motorcycle club after a federal arrest on his own timeline. He's acting on instruction. Payne, Lena said. She had come in from the back room and was standing with her phone in her hand, reading something on the screen. I just got a response from a contact at the federal courthouse. A motion was filed this morning, 45 minutes ago, by an attorney representing an unnamed third party requesting access to the sealed warrant materials for Mara Holloway's case, citing potential civil rights violations in the execution of the arrest. Pike turned from the window. That's the fastest I've ever seen a civil motion filed. It was drafted before last night, Lena said. This was prepared. They had the motion ready before the warrants were served, which means they knew. She stopped. They knew the warrants were coming, Ronan said. The room received that. They knew the warrants were coming. Mara Holloway's 7-month sealed federal case had a leak. Somewhere inside the federal investigation, or somewhere adjacent to it, somewhere with access to the information that a sealed case was pending. Someone had known and had prepared, had built a counter-response that was ready to deploy the moment the case became public. Call Holloway, Ronan said to Lena. Now. Lena was already dialing. She walked to the back room and closed the door. Ghost looked at Ronan. If the case has a leak, it changes the picture, Ronan said. It changes everything, Ghost said, because if they knew it was coming and they let it happen anyway, then the federal case was supposed to happen, Ronan said. They let Holloway make the arrest. They let the warrant get served. They let Victor go down. He paused. Because Victor going down was acceptable. Victor is one piece, the piece they can afford to lose. The rain moved across the roof of the chapter house. The two unmarked sedans sat at their respective positions on the street, engines running, patient. They're cutting Victor loose, Pike said, and using the noise of his arrest to bury the larger structure. While using us, Ghost said, as the distraction, the vigilante narrative. While everyone's looking at 14 bikers who crashed a gala, nobody's asking what the CFSI money was actually funding. Nobody's asking about Payne. Nobody's asking why a defense contractor was running $900,000 through a domestic violence nonprofit. Ronan walked to the window. He stood there and looked at the sedans. He was very still. He was thinking about Dana Marsh, about a car outside Raleigh in 2011, about a retraction and a resignation and the specific silence that follows when a story dies not because it was wrong, but because it became inconvenient to the wrong people. He was thinking about how long certain things have been running, how deep the roots go when something has had 14 years to grow in the dark. He was thinking about a 9-year-old boy eating eggs in the kitchen 10 feet away, whose existence had been the variable nobody planned for, the element that was not in the strategic calculation, that couldn't have been, because it was not strategic. It was a child with $3 and a split lip who walked through a door, and the doors that opened were not the doors that anyone on either side of this thing had predicted. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different from the previous unknown number. Different pattern, different prefix. He answered. Creed. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the specific diction of a man accustomed to giving instructions in environments where giving instructions was normal, calm, precise. You don't know me. My name is not something I'm going to give you on this call. What I am going to give you is 60 seconds of information that you are going to need in the next 12 hours. Ronan said nothing. He walked away from the window, away from the others, to the far corner of the room. The motion filed this morning is a feint, the voice said. The actual legal instrument is being prepared for filing at 2 p.m. today. It is not a civil rights challenge to the warrant. It is a request for emergency injunction against the Iron Revenant Motorcycle Club, designating the organization as a criminal enterprise under RICO statute, based on documentation that, I want to be clear about this, does not reflect anything the club has actually done. The documentation has been manufactured. It is sophisticated and it will take time to disprove. But the injunction, if granted, would freeze the chapter's assets, restrict the members' movements, and effectively dissolve your ability to function as an organization. Ronan's grip on the phone tightened. He said nothing. The judge assigned to the motion, the voice continued, has a relationship with Richard Payne that predates Payne's retirement. They served together in the same JAG unit in 1991. The motion will be heard on an emergency basis. It has been designed to move faster than your legal counsel can respond to it. Why are you telling me this? Ronan said. A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to answer, but the pause of someone who has already made the decision and is giving the question the weight it deserves before delivering the response. Because Dana Marsh was my daughter, the voice said. The world went very still. Outside the chapter house on the wet December street, the two unmarked sedans continued their patient vigil. Inside, Pike and Ghost and Teddy stood in the main room, not speaking. In the kitchen, a 9-year-old boy ate his breakfast with his shoulder touching his mother's arm. In the back room, Lena Parrish was on the phone with Mara Holloway, her voice low and urgent. And in the corner of the main room, Ronan Creed stood with a phone pressed against his ear and the architecture of the last 14 years reconfiguring itself around 4 words that had just changed the shape of everything. And before he could form a response, before he could locate language, the voice spoke again. They know you know about Payne now, it said, which means the 2 o'clock filing isn't the endgame. The 2 o'clock filing is to keep you in this building, dealing with lawyers and paperwork, while the other thing happens. What other thing? Ronan said. The pause this time was, what other thing? Ronan said. The pause lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the rain continued against the roof and the sedans continued on the street and the world continued its indifferent rotation. Claire Mercer, the voice said. They're going to move on Claire Mercer. Not through the courts, not through the sheriff, directly. Another beat. She has documentation she removed from the firm, physical copies. They know she has them. They've known since the night Victor locked her in that cellar. The arrest last night changed their timeline. They can't wait for legal instruments. They need what she has before it reaches Holloway. The call ended. Ronan moved. He covered the distance to the kitchen in 4 steps. Claire was at the table, Evan beside her, Biscuit at the counter. They looked up at the specific quality of his entry, the velocity of it, the compression of his face, the thing that happens to a room when someone enters it, having already made a decision. The documentation you took from the firm, he said. Where is it? Claire's face did not change the way a surprised person's face changes. It changed the way a person's face changes when they've been waiting for a question and the waiting is finally over. My car, she said. There's a panel in the trunk, below the spare. Where's the car? Victor made me leave it at the firm 8 months ago, she said. He said I didn't need it. It's still in the lot on Mercer Street. She paused. He never knew about the panel. I put it in myself. Does anyone know that lot? Know your car is there? She thought for half a second. The firm would know. My car's been there 8 months. They'd have my plate. Ronan turned. Pike. Pike was already in the doorway. Mercer Street parking lot, Ronan said. Claire's car. Dark blue Civic, 8 months parked. Panel in the trunk below the spare. He looked at Pike. Take Ghost and Teddy. Fast. The sedans. Go out the back through the machine shop. Martinez has the side gate. Go. Pike was gone before the sentence finished. Ronan turned back to Claire. Is there anything else? Anywhere else? She looked at him steadily. My email. I forwarded copies to a personal account Victor didn't know about. But if they're as deep into the system as you're suggesting, assume they have it, Lena said from the hallway. She had come in at some point, had heard enough. Her phone was in her hand and she was already texting with the compact, rapid precision of a woman managing multiple vectors simultaneously. I'm contacting Holloway about the 2 o'clock filing. She needs to know about Payne and the judge connection before it hits the docket. Can she block it? Ronan said. She can file a counter motion. She can alert the Federal Oversight Office to the judicial relationship. Lena looked up. She can create noise. Whether it's faster than their machinery, she left it there. Ronan looked at Evan. The boy was watching him. He had stopped eating. He had his fork in his hand and he was watching Ronan with the absolute, unblinking attention of a child whose threat detection system has been calibrated by years of living in a house where reading the room was survival. "I need you to stay in this building," Ronan said to him. "Right here, with Biscuit. You don't open any door, you don't go near the windows, you understand?" "Yes," Evan said. "If anything happens that feels wrong, I know what wrong feels like," Evan said. Ronan looked at him for a half second. The weight of that sentence, the specific, terrible competence of it, moved through him, and he let it move, and he filed it, and he turned to Biscuit. "Nobody in," he said. "I don't care what they're wearing." Biscuit nodded once. He had the expression of a man who has been given a job he is qualified for and intends to perform it. Ronan pulled on his cut. He checked his phone. Pike had been gone 4 minutes. Mercer Street was 6 minutes at pace. He had a window, and the window was closing, and the closing of it was the sound of something larger than one night, larger than one arrest, larger than a ballroom and a wine cellar. 14 years of buried truth pressing toward the surface, and the people who'd buried it doing what buried things do when they feel the earth shifting above them. He went to the window. One of the sedans had moved. North position was now 2 blocks closer. They'd seen Pike's group leave. They were recalculating. He pulled out his phone. He made a call to a number in his contacts listed only as a first initial. The call connected on the 3rd ring. "I need the Brotherhood activated," he said. "Regional, every chapter within 2 hours. Not armed, not aggressive, just present. Whitmore Street, Mercer Street parking lot, and this address." He paused. "Call it a gathering. Call it whatever you want. I need volume." He hung up. He looked at Ghost, who had materialized at his shoulder. "I thought you went with Pike," Ronan said. "Pike doesn't need me for a parking lot," Ghost said. "You might need me here." Ronan looked at him. Ghost had the face of a man who has made a calculation and will not be argued out of the result. "The sedans are repositioning," Ghost said. "They're not just watching anymore." "No," Ronan said. "They got a call when our people moved. Someone's making a decision right now about whether to hold position or escalate." He paused. "They escalate and they have a problem. This becomes public in a way they can't manage. They hold and they lose the window on the documentation." "So we made them choose," Ghost said. "We made them choose." His phone buzzed. "Pike." "We have the car." Pike's voice was tight, compressed. "Ronan, there's someone already here. Dark SUV on the south end of the lot. 2 men, plain clothes. They were moving toward the Civic when we came in." "Are they moving now?" "They stopped. They're looking at us." "How many of you?" "3. Ronan thought for exactly 1 second. "Hold your position. Don't approach them. Don't touch the car yet. Just be there." He ended the call. He looked at Ghost. "I need to be in that lot," he said. They went out the back. Through the machine shop, the door that connected the chapter house to the adjacent building, the building that shared the lot's back perimeter, the exit that the sedans on the street didn't have sight lines to. Martinez, who ran the machine shop and had for 11 years, and who had a relationship with the Iron Revenant that was practical and unspoken and ran in both directions, was at his bench when they came through. He did not look up. He pointed at the far door without stopping what he was doing. Outside the rain. Cold and sideways, the kind that gets inside your collar before you've taken 3 steps. Ronan's bike was in the back row, frost still on the seat from the night before. He threw a leg over and started it, and the Harley spoke its declaration into the wet morning air, and he pulled out through the back alley onto the cross street and opened it up. 6 minutes. The roads were empty. Too early, too wet, a Saturday morning that had decided to be inhospitable and succeeded. He ran 2 amber lights, and the engine sound went off the buildings on either side, a moving wall of sound that scattered pigeons from a cornice on Merchant Street and woke someone's dog behind a fence on 5th. He turned onto Mercer Street and saw the lot. Pike and Ghost's bikes were at the north entrance, Teddy's at the east. And in the center of the lot, a dark blue Civic with 8 months of grime and 1 cracked rear taillight sat between its empty neighboring spaces like something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, with the particular patience of objects that outlast the circumstances that abandoned them. The dark SUV was still at the south end. Both men were still standing. They had not moved toward the Civic. They had not moved toward Pike's group. They were in the specific stasis of people who are waiting for instruction and whose instruction has not yet arrived. Ronan pulled in. He killed the engine. He got off the bike and he walked across the wet asphalt toward the Civic, and he did not look at the SUV and he did not look at the two men. He walked to the Civic's trunk and he opened it and he found the panel and he found what was inside the panel. A manila envelope, thick, sealed with tape, with Claire Mercer's handwriting on the front in marker. A date, 8 months ago, and two initials he didn't recognize but would ask about. And he held it in his hands in the rain and he looked at it. He heard the SUV door open. He turned. One of the men had stepped out. He was 40, broad, with the particular bearing of law enforcement or military or the private sector version of both. He was not reaching for anything. He was just standing, his hands visible in the rain. He looked at Ronan across 40 feet of wet asphalt with an expression that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that he had been sent here to retrieve something, and that the something was in Ronan's hands, and that the situation had arrived at a moment where decisions were being made by everyone present about what kind of moment this was going to become. Ronan looked at him. He held the envelope. Pike was to his left. Teddy at the east entrance. Ghost had come in behind him and was somewhere at his right shoulder in the way Ghost was always somewhere when it mattered. The rain came down. The man took one step forward, and then the sound arrived, from the south, from the north, from the east, rolling in from multiple directions simultaneously, growing from a vibration in the wet air to a physical presence, to something you felt in the chest before you heard it with your ears. The sound of engines, many of them, converging. Harleys by the dozen and then by the score. The regional brotherhood responding to a call that had gone out 40 minutes ago, arriving now in waves, filling Mercer Street and the adjacent blocks with the specific low thunder of a thing that has decided to be present, that is not here for violence, but is here undeniably, filling every sightline, every exit calculation, every version of a next move that the man across the asphalt had prepared himself for. The man stopped. He stood in the rain. He looked at Ronan. He looked at the street filling with motorcycles. He looked back at Ronan. Ronan held the envelope against his chest, inside his cut, against the pocket where 3 folded dollar bills still sat against his heart. He looked at the man. "Tell Payne," he said, "that Dana Marsh's father sends his regards." The man's face changed. It was small and it was fast, but it was the change of a man who has just heard a name he did not expect, and whose entire operational understanding of the situation has just been revised in a direction he is not prepared for. He looked at Ronan, and for the first time since the SUV door opened, what was in his face was not calculation. It was something closer to fear. He got back in the SUV. The SUV sat for 30 seconds. Then it pulled out of the south end of the lot and into the street and was gone, and the sound of its engine dissolved into the much larger sound of 100 motorcycles idling in the December rain on Mercer Street, their collective breath rising in white clouds into the gray morning air, their headlights burning against the dark wet asphalt like 100 small fires that refused to go out. The envelope went to Mara Holloway at 9:47 that Saturday morning, hand-delivered by Lena Parrish to the federal field office on Canton Street, with a 12-page legal memorandum documenting the chain of custody, the circumstances of its discovery, and a formal request for emergency protective designation for Claire Mercer and her minor child. Lena had written the memorandum in the back room of the chapter house between 6 and 9 a.m. while running on 2 hours of sleep and the particular cold focus that she deployed in situations where focus was the only tool that mattered. Mara Holloway read the envelope's contents in her office with the door closed for 41 minutes. When she came out, she made 4 phone calls. The 2 o'clock RICO motion was never filed. The judge assigned to it recused himself at 1:15, citing a newly disclosed conflict of interest that his clerk described to the court reporter as personal in nature, and that the Caldwell County Gazette, which ran the story 3 days later, described more specifically as a 32-year friendship with a retired defense contractor currently under federal investigation for financial crimes connected to a domestic violence nonprofit. Richard Payne was served with a federal subpoena on a Tuesday in January at the front door of his home in a gated community 40 miles north of Caldwell County by 2 federal agents and Mara Holloway, who had driven up herself because some things you do in person. He did not say anything when she handed him the documents. He looked at them for a long moment in his open doorway. in his bathrobe, in the gray January morning, and then he looked at Mara Holloway with the expression of a man who has spent a very long time being confident that certain distances could be maintained and who has just discovered that the distance has closed. He said, "I'd like to call my attorney." "That's your right," Mara said. He stepped back inside. She waited on the porch. Behind her, in the federal vehicle, one of the agents was filling out paperwork. The neighborhood was quiet. Someone's sprinkler system ran through its winter maintenance cycle at the end of the block. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. She thought about a parking lot on Mercer Street in the rain, and a man holding an envelope against his chest, and 100 motorcycles filling the street behind him. She thought about a 9-year-old boy with $3 and split knuckles. She thought about 7 months of sealed documentation and all the things that documentation could prove and all the things it couldn't, and the things it couldn't that had been proved anyway by a child walking through a door. She waited on the porch until Payne's attorney answered his call. Then she went to work. Victor Halden pled guilty to 11 of 12 federal counts in March, on the advice of counsel who had spent 2 months reviewing the evidence and arrived at the recommendation with the specific, exhausted honesty of a lawyer who has run every calculation available and found them all pointing the same direction. He received 14 years. The sentencing judge noted in her remarks that the particular nature of the crimes, the weaponization of survivor advocacy as a mechanism of financial fraud, the abuse committed behind the shield of public reputation, the systematic protection purchased through institutional relationships, represented a betrayal of trust that the court found without meaningful mitigation. Victor sat at the defense table and said nothing. He had the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of something that he constructed very carefully over a very long time and is only now, at the terminus, fully understanding that everything he built was in service of something that was not real. He did not look at Claire when the sentence was read. Claire did not look at him either. She was sitting in the third row of the gallery, between Lena Parrish and a woman from the County Survivor Advocacy Office who had been Claire's caseworker for the past 3 months. She had her hands folded in her lap. Her face was composed, not the careful composed of someone managing something enormous, but the different composed of someone who has come through the enormous thing and is now standing on the other side of it, learning what it feels like to breathe without the particular weight that has been sitting on the chest for so long that you forgot it was there until it wasn't. Evan was not in the courthouse. He was at school. He had a math test that day that he had studied for, and Claire had asked him whether he wanted to come to the sentencing, and he had thought about it for a moment with the characteristic seriousness of his thinking, and said, "I already know how it ends. I studied for the test." She had looked at him across the breakfast table and felt something move through her that she didn't have a complete word for. Pride was part of it, and grief was part of it, and something that was neither of those things but lived in the same territory, the specific emotion of watching a person you love demonstrate that they are going to be okay in ways that cost them something to learn. She'd kissed his head. She'd driven him to school. Then she'd driven to the courthouse. The Black Ridge Country Club closed in February. The membership voted to dissolve after 3 consecutive months of canceled events, a membership attrition of 60%, and a front-page story in the regional paper that ran under a headline that nobody at the club had been able to agree on how to respond to. The building sat empty through the winter, its Georgian Revival facade maintaining its argument with the cold air that was increasingly difficult to find convincing. In April, a nonprofit filed acquisition paperwork for the property. The nonprofit was called the Haven House. Its founding board included Mara Holloway in an advisory capacity, Claire Mercer as Director of Survivor Services, and Lena Parrish as legal counsel. Its primary funding came from a consortium of motorcycle clubs, 17 chapters across 4 states, who had voted in a regional meeting in February to redirect their annual charity ride proceeds to the acquisition and renovation. The building's renovation took 4 months. The men who did most of the framing and the electrical and the drywall were not contractors. They were men who had day jobs and trades and who showed up on weekends with their own tools and worked until the light went. Some of them were Iron Revenant. Some were from other chapters. Some were not from any chapter at all, but had heard about the project through the specific informal network of people who do this kind of work, who show up when something needs doing without being asked twice. Biscuit ran the volunteer coordination. He had a clipboard and a scheduling system, and the organizational focus of a man who had spent 11 years working with at-risk youth and had retained every logistical skill the work had given him, while the disability had taken the direct work itself. He was, in the context of the renovation, in his element, which is to say he was everywhere at once and very loud about the things that needed to be loud about, and very quiet about the things that required quiet. The Haven House opened on the first Saturday of June. It was a warm morning, the first genuinely warm morning after a spring that had taken its time arriving. The kind of morning where the light has a quality that the previous 6 months didn't have, something that is not just the absence of cold, but the presence of something else, something that the body recognizes and responds to below the level of articulation. The trees along the drive had gone full green. Someone had planted flowers along the front walk. Claire had done it herself with Evan on a Thursday evening 2 weeks before the opening, the two of them on their knees in the dirt with trowels, putting things in the ground that would stay. The charity ride arrived at 10. They heard it before they saw it, the familiar sequence of one engine and then two, and then the accumulation, the sound building from the south, rolling up through the trees, filling the June morning with its low, organized thunder. Then the first bike came around the curve of the drive, and then the rest, in formation, Harleys by the dozen and then by the score, coming up the long approach to what had been the Blackridge Country Club and was now the Haven House, their chrome catching the morning light, their engines settling to an idle as they pulled into the parking area and found their places. Ronan came in last. He always came in last. He killed his engine and got off his bike and stood for a moment looking at the building, at the white brick and the columns that were the same as they had always been, but were now accompanied by different things: a painted sign, window boxes, the flowers along the walk, the specific quality of a building that is being used for something it was not originally designed for and has accepted the new purpose in the way that good structures do, by being solid and continuing to stand. He stood, and he looked at it, and he held his helmet in his hands, and the morning light came through the trees in the way it does in June when it's still low enough to be angled and everything it touches seems considered. Evan was waiting on the front steps. He was 10 now. February had arrived and been noted. Claire had taken him to the diner on Route 9, and the booth had been red vinyl, and the pie had been real, and nothing had interrupted it, and afterward Evan had said it was the best birthday he could remember, which Claire had received with the specific complicated emotion of a mother absorbing a sentence like that from her child, holding it carefully, knowing that the comparison it implied was real, and that the only useful response to it was to make more mornings like this one until they became the context rather than the exception. He was wearing a leather vest. It was custom, had been made by a man in the regional brotherhood who worked leather as his trade, who had spent 3 weeks on it, who had done the stitching by hand. It bore the Iron Revenant patch on the back, above it the designation Prospect in the traditional placement, and on the front left chest a patch that was not standard issue and did not appear on any other vest in the Brotherhood, that had been voted on and approved in a chapter meeting by unanimous decision. A small patch, simply rendered, that said, "Founding Member, the Haven House." Ronan walked up the front steps. He stopped in front of the boy. Evan looked up at him. He had grown 2 inches since December. His knuckles were healed, had been healed for months, the skin smooth over what had been split, the body having done what bodies do with damage when given time, and the absence of new damage. His eyes were the same eyes, the eyes that had looked across a bar in a chapter house and said, "Those aren't always the same thing," with the gravity of someone who had paid for the knowledge. Ronan reached into the breast pocket of his cut. He took out 3 folded dollar bills. He had kept them there since December, had moved them from vest to vest through the winter and into the spring, a habit he didn't examine too closely, because some habits are not about logic. He held them out to Evan. Evan looked at the money. He looked at Ronan. "Job's done," Ronan said. Evan took the $3. He held them for a moment, looking at them, at the crumpled bills that had been folded and carried and folded again, that had traveled from a sock drawer to a bar counter to a breast pocket through December and March, and the length of a federal case and 4 months of renovation weekends. He held them with both hands. Then he folded them. Once. Twice. He pressed them into the front pocket of his leather vest over his chest and patted the pocket once. He looked up at Ronan. "Thank you," he said. Ronan put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Not long, just long enough. Then he walked past him into the Haven house, where Claire was standing in the front hallway with coffee in both hands and the expression of a woman standing in a building she helped make, on a morning that exists because of a chain of things she could not have predicted, looking at the door she came through herself and is now holding open for others. She handed him one of the coffees. He took it. He stood beside her. They looked out through the open front door at the parking area full of motorcycles and the men climbing off them and stretching and talking and the morning light going everywhere. "How many today?" she said. 212, he said, from 17 chapters. She was quiet for a moment, then, "He saved $3. "He did," Ronan said, "for 6 weeks. "Yes?" She looked at the parking lot. She looked at the sign above the door. She looked at Evan on the front steps, who was already talking to Ghost. Ghost, who never talked to anyone, who was crouched on the top step with his arms on his knees, listening to a 10-year-old explain something with the earnest, detailed precision of a child who has discovered he has an audience and intends to use it fully. "What do I owe you?" Claire said. Ronan drank his coffee. He looked out at the morning, at the bikes, at the Brotherhood settling into the June air, at the building that had been built on the ruin of something false and was now being used for something true. "Nothing," he said. "We accepted the job." The charity ride left the Haven house at 11. 212 motorcycles moving through the June morning in formation, down the long drive and out onto the county roads, their sound traveling ahead and behind through the green leaf trees and the warm air and the length of a Saturday that had decided, after a long winter, to be generous with its light. Evan stood on the front steps and watched them go. He watched until the last bike rounded the curve and the sound began to fade, dropping by degrees the way thunder fades after a storm. Not all at once, but gradually, the way large things depart, leaving behind them a silence that is larger than the silence that existed before they arrived, a silence that has been changed by what moved through it. He stood in that silence for a moment. Then he went inside where his mother was, where there was coffee and the sound of voices and the particular warmth of a building being used for what it was made for, and he closed the door behind him against the bright morning, and the sound of engines faded the rest of the way into the distance, and Caldwell County went about its Saturday, and the world, which had been cold for a very long time, was for this moment, in this place, something else entirely.